Yura, nga bele malara, nga jundal, nga maripa biking, nginero kogom kuchun, nga jakira, nga nunakal nugi gorompo jundal balkanya terangarino. Good afternoon, everybody. It is so lovely to be here, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands that we are meeting on this afternoon. And I would like to acknowledge that my people just across the bay on North Stradbroke Island have had a very long-standing connection and relationship with this country here. I'm very grateful to be here today with you all and with our wonderful panel. All right. When we can start to consider how traditional knowledges can be used with agritech to unlock the Indigenous estate, we first need to understand exactly what do we mean by Indigenous estate. What does that include? And how do we work with stakeholders to ensure holistic land management and drive prosperity for our communities? So, for our panel, I'd like to invite you all this afternoon, to start with the question, what is the Indigenous estate? Nini, I might start with you.
Sure. Mobile ngora. Good afternoon, everyone. From a Yarra perspective, the Indigenous estate is Yarra traditional country that is owned or co-owned, preserved, managed, protected by Yarra people. So it is our country in entirety.
Beautiful.
Perfect, like you didn't ask me first. I think the estate's kind of everything. We live, we breathe, we do everything. Everything works in unison. Our old people always taught us that, and I'm very lucky that I still, get to learn from our elders. But yeah, I believe it's everything. Everything.
And what about you, Josh?
Yeah, I want to start by acknowledging country and paying respects to elders past and present on these lands as well. For me, the Indigenous estate, I guess in terms of our academic definition, the Indigenous estate is about the legal interests and rights that mobs still own over country or still hold over country. It's bigger than agriculture, actually. So the definition of the Indigenous estate spans up to about 58% of Australia's landmass. Every state and territory have a commitment to increasing that estate by another 15%. So it's as big currently, if not bigger than what agriculture is. And I think that for me is the way in which I view the potential of the Indigenous estate. But then certainly, I think with this mob here, home is home. The Indigenous estate is much country for me, from where my country, and that's our place. That's where we belong.
And when you say it's 50% and we're wanting to increase those numbers, what exactly are you referring to in terms of what is that 50%?
So it's 58%. That represents the legal interest, whether that be native title or other land ownership structures that exist. It doesn't actually account for private title that mob own through either as individuals or as organisations, but certainly gives a representative sample as to what that kind of looks like.
Absolutely. Much bigger. So bigger than the agricultural estate. Incredible. And what about you, Chris?
Yuridu Meringue. Well, last time I looked, Terra nullius was a lie. So as far as I could see, the Indigenous estate's still 100%. Mm-hmm. And probably picking up on Josh's point, there's been an academic study and there's a figure on it. But if you sort of looked at, what's being banked, what's being held freehold title, what's creating intergenerational wealth, what's on the Murray-Darling Basin, that number sort of slides down a lot closer to zero. Mm. So, it's a vexed issue, and obviously there's opportunities to improve those figures and realise some economic benefits by actually talking a little bit of truth about what it represents and what's able to happen on some of those lands and who's getting the wealth off some of those communal titles and native titles. I mean, they sit over some of the richest postcodes in Australia. I don't see too many black fellas that are billionaires yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this leads me to my next question when we're considering the Indigenous estate and the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always cared for country and looked after it and worked with it for our own survival and in caring for the entire ecosystem around us. I'm curious to hear your thoughts now on what is Indigenous agriculture in the 21st century. Chris, might come to you.
Yep.
Right, Josh?
I mean, let me pick on a point that Liz made earlier this morning. She's talked about the southwestern part of WA, and if she had to rely on a lot of food produced down there, it'd be a pretty unbalanced food group. But Liz was sort of talking about what that food group might have meant for about 150 years ago. It's not the food group that would have sustained people for 60,000 years. So I think one of the things about Indigenous agriculture is it is a bit of a construct, because it sort of pits agriculture against environment, whereas you sort of think about country as being, it's the joining of that. And so it's something a bit more respectful of both those sides that provides long term. And Indigenous ag sort of sits as being a bit more, it's more agile, it's more adaptable ag. So it might have had a sense pre-colonisation, but it could be adapted now because it's an agriculture that looks forward and understands the story of country and is a lot more adaptable to things like climate change. So I think rather than sort of ring fence it into particular things, I think it is deeply seeded into the country it sits on with the people that work on it, but it's this hugely adaptable sort of approach to farming.
Excellent.
Yeah, I don't disagree. So I think if we have a look at the history of what Indigenous agriculture has been, we've had 60,000 plus years of farming systems, working with country, trial and error, to developing a system over time that sustained Indigenous people for such a long period of time. So for me, I think there's an acknowledgement of that. I think there's an acknowledgement of the last 200 odd years of colonisation, and we know mob worked side by side with white farmers as well to cultivate land, to understand where the best grasses were growing for their cattle, working with and alongside non-Indigenous producers to farm country. There's obviously some upsets through that process, and it certainly isn't a rosy picture, but I think for me where Indigenous agriculture is now is actually kind of breaking up the terms, I think, and just being really black and white about it, is an Indigenous person farming whatever agriculture looks like today. And that's a really kind of nuanced approach, and that definition, I guess, isn't special, but it provides that adaptability piece that Chris talked about. It provides the openness, and it also removes the pitting against Indigenous people and agriculture as two separate things. And I kind of liken this concept to cowboys and Indians. We see them as like kind of two unique different groups, but actually Indigenous agriculture is the coming together of ancient, traditional knowledge systems with Western agriculture over the last 200 years to provide good, agricultural practices, sustainability, and just being an Indigenous person farming with our own identity today.
Yeah. Ryan?
Everything that they said. No, it really depends where you are in the country. So, on the East Coast, they do stuff different. Like I've been working out at Longreach recently, and exactly as you said, like Tarabara is the traditional owner group we're helping out there, and we're helping them divest 22,000 acres from the ILSC. But they've gone back to getting the landscape. It was a cattle station to back to how it looked previously, and we had an uncle showing us around there, and they dammed up a couple of dams so the cattle could drink. But then he showed us how, if you just removed a couple of things, this was a whole water table, which could then just keep flowing and feed everything, and then feed all the ag in that area. And then they do cultural burning out there, and there was a massive difference from what I'd seen, because I grew up pretty sheltered life, played rugby league most of my life, grew up in Tweed Heads. And was lucky to grow up in culture, but to see how they do stuff differently inland Australia, like they took us through a cultural burning out there. We had to be there within a day of, I think it was 25 mils of rain. Their neighbouring cattle property did it 4 days after. It's still brown like 2 years after, whereas this traditional land is green. So it's just working together, figuring out the best ways to do it, and we're all living on one of the greatest countries in the world. Let's help each other make it great.
Yeah, absolutely. Nenny, what are your thoughts on
Indigenous ag is obviously ag undertaken by First Nations people, but fundamentally it applies traditional practices and it applies traditional ecological knowledge into how ag practices are facilitated, how farming is facilitated. And I think importantly, something that I've found not only for my own mob, but more broadly is that central to it is concepts, values and approaches on sustainability. So that's what I'd say Indigenous ag is.
Absolutely. And it's, when we consider it, I suppose, historically we haven't always considered Indigenous people as agriculturalists or really being participating in that industry. And it almost seems like it's something entirely separate. But what we know as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and people in this space is the exact opposite, that it's all-encompassing, that it does reference our knowledges and the work and the role that we've played historically, currently and moving forward. I'd like to touch a little bit on the importance of broadening our perspectives of Indigenous agriculture for our listeners in the room and anybody who might be joining us, around why that's so important in the 21st century. Why is it important for us to consider those broader perspectives of what is Indigenous agriculture? And how does that relate back to agritech?
Starting down the end, or do you want me to talk? I'll talk, why not? I think it's just because we looked at everything as holistic and sustainability and making sure there was always, caring for the country and making sure it was always sustainable. So it's just taking that in. I know agriculture is moving in a way where we have to look after kind of everyone here in Australia, but if you listen and learn, there's a lot more we can actually learn from our First Nations people, and I found that when I go out on country, you can't learn if you don't go out there, so the best thing is to do is get out on country and actually learn, get the red dirt in between your toes and go listen and talk to traditional owners and see how they've done it on their land. It was great to hear the uncle before talking about what he does up in the Cape, so he literally said, come out and we'll show you how to do it. More people should just get up and see how they do it. It's actually not that hard.
Absolutely, which transitions beautifully into my next question. Nini, you have an absolute wealth of knowledge and experience as the CEO of Nyamba Buru Yawaru. Forgive me, I had to make sure I pronounced that properly. And in your role representing native title holders in the Broome region. Drawing on your experience, can you share with us some information about Yawaru's estate, particularly the agricultural portfolio, and how you are applying holistic management?
I'll just start, because I should have done this earlier, by saying Mabungoragora, Ngaji Gorajin, Ngayu Nelawal Nini, Ngayu Ngan Banaga Jandu, Ngayu Ngambala Nyaru Nganburu, Ngayu Bibi Gujara Jiranel, Nelawal Jira Daji at Bigin Maya, Ngayu Maja Jandu, Nyambaburu Yara Nyedwa. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my deepest respects to the First Nations people, traditional custodians of the land that we're all on today, to their elders past and present, and acknowledging all First Nations people in the room here. So Yaru country, I can't see everybody because of these bright lights, but just by show of hand, I'll just try and make out people's hands if you put it up. Who's been to Broome before? So a few of you. Beautifulest place in the world. So sorry, Trevor, I don't know about Cape York, but Broome is magnificent. But as they say, home is where the heart is. Just by way of brief background context, in 2006, Yaru's native title determination came through the federal court. And so in that process, 530,000 hectares of traditional Yaru country was determined native title lands. That Yaru estate in entirety is inclusive of various different parcels of land, various different tenures. So we have a significant portion of conservation estate, we have a significant portion of pastoral lease, we have freehold land, we hold 80% of the developable land in Broome, and there's also Indigenous protected areas, so multi-tenure, multifaceted landscape. As it relates to our ag portfolio, our pastoral lease covers 276,000 hectares of land, and it has the capacity to hold 20,000 head of cattle. We also have an export depot whereby we export cattle mostly to Indonesia, and in an annual period we can export up to 80,000 head. We are looking at diversification options and looking at vertical integration, whereby we've got a 3 gigalitre water licence to do an irrigated ag area, and that's likely to produce fodder. I'm not sure that there's any other traditional owner groups across the country that has a broad range of kind of portfolio, ag portfolio that we do. So we're really placed in the spotlight, but I think importantly as it relates to ensuring we apply holistic development, we apply practices that are sustainable. And so from a Yarra perspective, our vision, which I will share with everyone, is to sustain a strong, proud, prosperous Yarra community that's grounded in Bulgarigara, that's grounded in our culture. And our mission is to establish Mabulian, strong, positive sense of well-being, both at an individual and communal level. The reason why I share that is because I think economic development, even from a Western perspective, the true definition is around the well-being of a society or as a community. So it is important for us to ensure that we apply a quadruple bottom line and an approach that is, again, holistic in nature and that is centred around Yarra cultural, philosophical and spiritual philosophies, because those things, as Josh mentioned previously, that sustained our culture and our community and our societies for thousands and thousands of years and many, many generations. So I think there's a lot to be learned in that regard, and I think there's a real big opportunity for agritech and the way that we do farming, or we produce cattle, all of these things, how we do it in a much more sustainable way. I think climate change is a big global crisis at this point in time, so it's forcing people, it's forcing governments, communities, organisations to really think deeply and meaningfully around how we do this. And just in kind of final words, I'd just say that I often share with people, are we as Yarra with an amazing ag portfolio, are we beef producers, are we custodians of culture, are we environmental stewards, are we business people? We're all of the above. So I think it's really important to think about how you maximise the outcomes and opportunities as it relates to all of those strategic kind of pillars, and do it in a way that's much more comprehensive and impactful. Yeah.
That's incredible. And do you have any specific examples of holistic management that you're applying?
Sure. So on Gummarunganjal Robot Plains Station, we have been working with ANU, Australian National University, to use standard environmental accounting metrics. And according to global experts, what we've been able to do in its adaptation by way of incorporating cultural value assets is the first of its kind. So we will now use that methodology to kind of have multi-layer analysis and data management, to ensure that we're developing the best practice sustainable grazing methods, how we're protecting our Indigenous protected areas in the most sophisticated way, applying traditional ecological knowledge and Western science. So that's a kind of tangible example. I think it's exciting for me to be here. We don't have, I can't sit here on the stage and say we've got the best agri-tech kind of systems and software in place at the moment, but right place to be to find it. So hopefully, there's opportunities for us to advance our methodologies and our systems going forward.
I guess, funnily enough, after we met on our first Zoom meeting, a month ago, we went onto the website because we're writing that property management plan to help them Tarabara divest, and they are literally the gold standard at the moment for Indigenous communities being able to self-sustain, look after themselves as a business. So just thought I'd give that little compliment as well.
What a testament.
I just wanted to add, I think if you think philosophically about what Nini is doing, for me, we actually don't have a definition of Australian agriculture. If you really question the agricultural system that we have the longest standing agricultural practice that ever happened anywhere in the world, here, still practiced by mob. We have an incorporated value set of what agriculture may have looked like in London, 200 years ago, imported by, a whole heap of people who were sent here for either to make money or to, because of their actions overseas, including stealing animals, my own family stealing sheep and then being left in charge of managing sheep stations. Kind of fascinating kind of narrative. But I think for me, the fundamental work that Nini's doing and what Indigenous agriculture is kind of leading and spearheading here in Australia is actually defining what agriculture is in Australia. So that when we have a brand agricultural, narrative overseas, that instead of just talking about 200 years of history, we can talk about 65,000 years of history, and the way in which Indigenous knowledge is being incorporated into cattle farming now, and crop development. All of that kind of narrative, it actually builds our perspective on what we are seen as Australians and what a truly Australian agricultural narrative is.
Absolutely.
I just add, this is and if you think about it from a business case perspective, it's all about vertical stacks. And we heard a little bit this morning about, agri-tourism. What Nini's basically business and a lot of opportunity, it's a vertical stack. It starts with every aspect of the landscape is a business, from the carbon in the soil to the biodiversity to the grains to sort of cropping and grazing models to trees and shrubs and the like. And then it's the overlay of things like cultural tourism and agri-tourism and all these sorts of benefits. And it's about sweating the asset. Here's an opportunity for First Nations leadership to actually show people how you actually sweat the asset, how you get more money per hectare by being able to do a lot more with less impact. And that's the gold ticket. Small footprint sort of on the carbon or on impact when it's doing harm, huge benefit coming out because all this socio-economic benefit, environmental benefit comes from taking on these approaches.
Absolutely.
And it means this is sort of greater independence, and you need instances like Nini's and others to be demonstrating, because at the end of the day, talk goes so far, but most people don't tell me, show me. And that's the really important part. What you're doing is showing people. Come and see. Have a look for yourself. Might not work in somebody else's country, but they're seeing a model that could be adapted. I think that's the important part of having this leadership in these areas.
Yeah. So I'm hearing less impact on the land by applying Indigenous knowledges of 65,000 years worth that have been passed down, but generating a greater impact for our communities and societies to have a healthy society, to go back to what you were saying earlier, Nini, and a massive congratulations after that short snippet of the conversation around the incredible work that your communities are doing and leading the way for mob all over the country. Really, absolutely. Ryan, you've also been making some pretty incredible contributions to the Indigenous business and community sector, including working with a broad range of communities across the country, commercialising Indigenous knowledges with recent examples of managing water titles. Can you share with us a little bit about that experience and what learnings we can apply from native land title to water title as it relates to agritech?
It's a lot. So I'm very fortunate enough. I think I got to live every kid's childhood dream where I got to play footy. So I'm a pretty good conduit between Indigenous people and business. I was lucky enough that myself, I had the backing of a 14-year NRL career. So I had money, I had networks, I had a business degree, an MBA, and it was still hard for myself. So I set on my journey to go out and help as many Indigenous businesses as I can, and a lot of it actually falls in the ag sector. So we're working with different communities at the moment with native title, helping divest, but then most recently we've been up to the Torres Strait and we met some wonderful people before, I think, are in the crowd, where they're doing a lot of work up in the Torres Strait as well, but they've got native title of the ocean. But I think when they gave native title of the ocean, they said Torres Strait were one community, where it's, if you've been up there, they're not one community. So they're actually, I think, in the middle of the consulting process of figuring out where, I guess, the soft borders lay and where they can cross, and how we're going up there to kind of help with business planning and ideas around. There's the new blue carbon initiative, which I believe has come out, so we can help them figure that out. Plus around commercial fisheries, the Torres Strait's got some of the great fishing areas in Australia, and how they can actually turn, I guess, native title of the ocean to create, I guess, social and economic benefit for the communities, because I think you can only hold freehold land in Torres Strait on Horn Island and on one or two of the islands, where the other ones are all council owned. So to give perspective, I feel as though, like, when I built stuff for myself, it makes me feel good because I know I get to own it, where a lot of those people on the outer islands, after speaking with them, having ownership of something's actually hard to do it on the land, because the council's kind of controlling that. So now they've got native title of the ocean. That's showing different ideas on how we can commercialise that and the best way forward for Marbiag. So we're heading up there next week, and hopefully, meeting with all the PBC and the right community members to get it going, because it's been a really big step up there, and hopefully we can get some great commercial outcomes, because they're still moving a little bit slow up there. There's a lot of problems up there with the water and everything, so they still got a Queensland postcode, so we're still, I believe they should still have every access to everything that we have here down on the Gold Coast as well. Queensland postcode, it's the same.
Absolutely. So that'll be an exciting space to consider, thinking about those agricultural models and shifting from land, but then what that can look like for water and for countries that sit on the water, and in this case salt water, but I'm sure there's many also, as we can see here with spring waters and all of that as well, that we have across all of our different countries. It brings me to our next point around when we're considering those economic opportunities and what financing models are available or needed to support communities to continue to unlock the Indigenous estate. And Josh, I understand you might have some thoughts on this.
Many. I think it's important to paint the picture of the way in which landscapes were used in Australia. I have the interesting dilemma, I guess, with my family history that our lands were first colonised 200 years ago for the purpose of agriculture as we see it today. Mm-hmm. The company 200 years ago had a remit of cultivating the wastelands of New South Wales, mm-hmm. and that's how our land was taken. And I think about the succession of the lack of intergenerational wealth that then has meant for our people. And I think to Ryan's point, to give you a real practical sense as to how much colonisation has impacted communities in terms of just practical access to services. Our land takes in Foster Tuncurry, which is a really beach, beautiful town nearly, I think maybe better than Broome, but anyway, I don't want to fight too hard. But really pristine place, right? Up until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Cabarita, which is one of the last missions of where our people got taken, including members of my family, up until 3 or 4 years ago, had no access to garbage bin pickup, had no access to street numbers, which meant that mail wasn't delivered. It also meant that when an ambulance was flying down the road trying to work out which house they had to stop at to access, to provide healthcare, there was no street numbers, so you basically had to wave the ambulance in to come and access that. So the lack of intergenerational wealth and even wealth as we see it today is kind of factored in through that process of colonisation. The way in which agriculture used the colonising process, that agriculture is a colonising act, the process of taking over land and getting rid of Aboriginal people and getting rid of native pests and diseases for the whole purpose of managing the wild, is the way in which agriculture was founded. So that has meant, predominantly in areas where agriculture was used as that purpose, which is most of Australia, Indigenous people have lacked the benefit of the intergenerational wealth that existed. It also meant that the relationship that we had with stations was quite fraught, because you effectively had a relationship that was based on having to rely upon the station for the lack of wages or slave labour, in which mob were working on stations to be able to get really rations, and fundamentally that was it. So the wealth wasn't being generated through that process either. We get to a place now where the likelihood of mob owning a home just generally is so far behind the rest of the national average that there are big conversations and ways in which I think we need to rethink that. But then home ownership's one thing, and it's somewhat easy when you get to agricultural properties, and everyone out here will know that you need a 40 or 50% deposit to put down on the farm to be able to go and start an agricultural venture, and it's just impossible. You don't have that 200 odd years of colonising history of, a mob not being paid right for their wages or benefiting from being able to, given lands through various government and non-government schemes. That's why finance is a challenge. The good news is that, that there's a way in which we can start thinking about that proactively and really thinking about what are the systems in place that can really support Indigenous producers, whether that be taking on philanthropic capital, whether we can reduce the risk from banks so that mob can go and farm in their own way. And I know Chris has got a lot to add to this, so I'll hand over to him to do the good glossy sell. But I think the process as to why we need these financial instruments, why it's different for Indigenous people is important when we think about the landscape, because it's not just it's hard to get a 40 or 50% deposit. It is, but there's also this 200-year-odd history that's meant that it's even harder for mob to access that.
Yeah, and I can see Chris is very eager to jump in here. He's saying, let me talk. Chris, you've got a background, an early career in global investment banking. And you've focused your career as well on accelerating asset-based community development outcomes, including supporting Indigenous organisations with nation rebuilding. And after this conversation, drawing on your experience, how do you see finance models, which I'm hearing are a really important part of unlocking the Indigenous estate? What role do they play?
Yeah, and I mean, just picking up on what Josh is saying, First Nations people, we're currently in the middle of 60 years since the Freedom Ride. So 60 years ago, Aboriginal people weren't allowed to go swim in the Moree baths and public pool. And it took another 2 years to have a referendum. And we're actually also in a state that doesn't believe in truth. So it's important to sort of, things have moved, but there's still a long way to go. And as you say, First Nations people are excluded out of the economy. So they haven't got the intergenerational wealth needed to put at risk. And if you think about farming, it's not only a challenging business, but then with climate change, it's an even more challenging business because of all the risks and the increasing unpredictability of that. But this is the opportunity for thinking about tech and thinking about involvement of First Nations people in the financing is actually listen to the stories. Listen to the Ninnies and the Ryans and Joshes and people. And part of this conversation comes from listening to a Ngambri-Cambri Wiradjuri fellow around his desire to be a farmer. And he said, I face two problems. One, I can't afford to buy the farm the way I want to. And if I go to the bank, I've got to get a white fella loan that won't let me farm the way I want to farm. So I need a black fella loan. And we sort of thought about, well, what would a black fella loan look like? Well, it wouldn't look like a loan that comes from England 200 years ago that says in Australia, which we know we have droughts and floods and other events, that you're not going to get the same revenue each year. So if I borrow $100, I'm not going to be able to pay back $10 each year because in the second or third year, I'll probably have a drought. So it doesn't make sense. Whereas a blackfella loan would say, well, here's $100. First year, have a good year. Pay us back 10. Oh, next year's a drought. We don't want you dragging a half-dead animal across dust because that's not good for the farmer. It's not good for the farm. That's not good for Australia. So pause it. Let Mother Earth rest so when the rains come and the drought breaks, it's better suited to bounce back. That's the sort of loan I want. Well, that loan looks an awful lot like HECS. I go get a degree, buy the farm, and I've got to pay my HECS back. But I don't start paying it unless I'm earning money. So if the farm's making money, I pay back a loan. If the farm's not making money, because it's in drought or in flood, it doesn't have to pay it back. And what that's allowing farmers, First Nations farmers, is that Girawa wanted to respect Mother Earth, wanted to show Yinjamara. Here's a loan that actually incentivises Yinjamara respect. And we don't hear that enough in finance. We don't hear the word respect and finance come together. So this notion of a loan, the Mother Earth loan, that works a bit like HECS is what's been developed. And in fact, normally over a period of time, it'll probably pay back faster than a standard loan. And the benefits to the nation, to the taxpayer, is you don't need government subsidies. Because when there's a drought, the loan's already put on pause. I don't need to go borrow money from the Regional Investment Corporation to pay back the bank for the payments I can't make because there's a drought. And what it's also doing is it's not giving farmers a whole lot of anxiety about paying back. And what it allows the farmer to do is look after the carbon in the soil, allows the farmer to look after the biodiversity, allows the farmer to maintain that country exactly the way they would have been maintaining it before. So here's an Indigenous designed loan system where we're drawing on 60,000 years of knowledge, where we're drawing on respect for country, where we're drawing on a culture that's managed unpredictability, that's been able to adapt. We're drawing on that knowledge rather than going out to old mate in England and saying, oh, what loans were you doing? Oh yeah, let's apply that. It's the same as what you said about farming. Oh, this is how we farmed in England, let's go farm in Australia the same way. We can see the damage that's caused, and now we can see what the damage caused by a financial system that doesn't get Australia. We have droughts, we have floods, we have natural disasters, we have intense fires. So why wouldn't we finance with that knowledge? So that's what Indigenous design finance has been all about. And because it sort of looks like HEX, one of the people helping sort of design all this has been Bruce Chapman, who actually brought in HEX about 40 years ago. And because I've got grey hair, he and I have a good relationship because I was part of the last generation of people that didn't have to pay HEX.
What's that like?
It's good. I look at my kids and go, sucked in. And stop whinging, because I'm over it.
Okay then. What I'm hearing is the importance of the structures that we operate within in not just the agricultural industry and agritech, but financing, and as a society that are more flexible, that have those values of caring for country and well-being at the core of how we're operating and how we're doing business, and why that's important. Because we do have droughts. We do experience a different climate and different things here in this country than we do in other continents. And we are a continent, which means we experience so much, such a broad and vast array of different types of natural disasters, different seasons, and we see that in farmers, agriculturalists, people, the environment are all affected by that. So you have my support for flexible financing models that enable Indigenous people to participate in these economic opportunities more, but without compromising the integrity of our values and what's important to us as custodians and caretakers.
And I think it's a financing system that obviously was designed to support First Nations freehold ownership of properties, but it's a financing system that should be undertaken by many other farmers. I mean, there's a whole dearth of young farmers who can't afford, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, can't afford to come into the market because of the uncertainty of climate change and that level of risk. And if we could de-risk some of the finance obligation, it enables the whole of the agricultural sector to move forward a little bit more easy. And so I think it's this importance of saying what was unlocking it was the Indigenous design and that thinking. Put that in front of things, and I think technology can look to that. You don't need a blackfella to build it, but have a think about how they might approach it and make sure that they're beneficiaries of what comes out of that thinking.
Absolutely. And the important point, one of the important points there as well, is remembering and acknowledging that Indigenous knowledges and values benefit everybody, the environment and all people who are participating by putting them into practice. I'm mindful of time, and so I might pose one last question to each to answer around what role does agritech play in driving prosperity for Indigenous businesses and communities and the sacred Indigenous knowledges that they hold?
I think I would probably reposition that question around how traditional knowledge and practices can advance agri-tech to ensure more sustainable, economic development businesses and opportunities for people and communities in their own right, but for the country more broadly. I probably challenge the audience and people in this forum to consider how you engage with First Nations people to understand those perspectives and that value proposition, and then how you use that to consider the development of agritech that is inclusive of First Nations information and knowledge. So that's my final 2 cents worth.
I've heard 2 different things there. My brain's going a million miles an hour. Just listen, learn, and just go out and, I guess the best thing I've ever done is just go out and listen and learn. It's going to be different everywhere you go. It's just one of those things. Also on the financing, I'm lucky enough I get to work with the Brisbane Broncos still, and we get to help 3,500 young Indigenous year 9 to 12 girls. A lot of them won't actually get into ag because they're out in Charleville, Cunnamulla. But they can't be what they can't see. So we need more Indigenous people in this area. And if that's through Indigenous financing, that sounds like a great model. It is hard to get. I made hundreds of thousands playing footy, and it was still hard for me to get finance. So I could imagine what it's like. A lot of those traditional owner groups are a lot land rich, but business poor, and not asset poor, but I guess getting access to capital is really one of the challenges, because that generational wealth, my kids will be lucky to see it, but my mum was a stay-at-home mum, dad worked his ass off to get me to where I got to. So it's just looking at it a holistic view and just getting out there and doing it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Josh?
No pressure with the time left.
Any final thoughts?
I would just say, I think for me, the engagement of Indigenous people through agriculture generally, let alone ag tech, provides a massive opportunity for agriculture to really reflect on what the opportunities could be into the future, how we redefine Australian agriculture, but also just from a practical sense. The session this morning talked a lot about labour, and we know Indigenous labour or Indigenous people in remote communities are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed than non-Indigenous people. For me, there's this really simple matching of the dots between a really Indigenous workforce sitting in regional and remote areas, people in regional and remote areas looking for workers and saying that they can't find anyone, and there's a simple connecting of the dot. There's a lot of historic reasons why that needs to be addressed, but I think there's an opportunity there that I think agriculture often overlooks.
Perfect.
I'd probably, from personal experience as a non-Indigenous person, the first part is that invitation. There's going to be a lot of tech organisations that don't have any Indigenous representation who want to rush into this space. Trick is, wait for the invitation. I think that's a really important part. Come in when you're invited. The other part is just remember, for most of the landscapes, First Nations people are being kept off them. So there's been no sort of adaptive land management practices. So the change in the soil that used to be a metre deep and now it's almost like porcelain, certain things like fire and certain crops and grasses that would have grown will be different. So what does tech do to fill a knowledge gap when you haven't been able to adapt practices that would have been traditional for thousands of years to this damaged landscape? And I think there's opportunities to unlock some of that knowledge within the tech sector.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for joining us for this wonderful conversation this afternoon.